One of the many and perhaps most obvious contradictions between one religion to another, and indeed between religion and science, is the vast variation between creation myths, and of course what science says happened at the beginning of time or at the beginning of our universe. I don't pretend to have the entire answer to that, but I can tell you how I personally approach it, for whatever that's worth. First of all, to me, science probably does have the most accurate way of reading the evidence thus far. I'm not saying it has all the answers. It doesn't. In fact, it's pretty darned hazy in a lot of areas. But as far as we know, science does seem to represent pretty accurately, or at least as far as we understand, what is happening physically in the universe, and probably how we began to a good extent, or at least physically how we began. Not to discount what many religions say happened, but this is the way I personally approach it. I certainly believe, to a great extent, that many of the things that people have said throughout history over the thousands of years, whether it be the Jews, the Hindus, or the Aborigines of Australia, I think they all have an incredibly valid way of approaching the way the universe was created, or the way we were created. But it may not be quite as literal as some people like to believe. Now, first of all, the Christians may be right, or should I say the extreme Christian fundamentalists who believe in Genesis, for instance, is in a very, very literal way. That could be true. I'm not saying it isn't. It is entirely possible that the very Christian personal God created everything, created the earth and the universe, and just made it the age that it appears. And so even though science reads it as being billions of years old, it's only 6,000 years old, and all the dinosaur bones were put there just to mess with us. Who knows? There's always a theory that the universe doesn't have to have existed any more than last week, right? I mean, we don't know that for certain. It could have been created a few seconds ago for all we know. But as far as we can tell, assuming that the evidence can be read the way it is, the Earth does seem to be a little older than 6,000 years old. Now, from my perspective, that isn't really a contradiction. First of all, how did we even come by these things in the first place? Well, people who talk about the Torah say God handed these things down, and God spoke to man. Now, how does God speak to man? Obviously, there's a lot of contradiction on that, but no matter how you want to put it, God speaking to man whatsoever is going to be some kind of a mystical experience. And we can argue all day over what mystical experience really means, but obviously shamans and prophets and all kinds of different mystics over the thousands of years have experienced higher planes of existence, have meditated, have gone into trances, all kinds of different ways of putting it, to touch other realms, to have God, or whatever you want to look at being above or beyond or inside, telling you things. Now, let's assume for a moment, just a moment, that the scientific way of looking at the world is essentially true. That the planets and the suns were all formed by gases over a long period of time. Maybe not exactly, maybe not down to the billionth year, but essentially what they say happened. Now let's say that someone who, and we don't know exactly how the Bible was written, we don't know even exactly when it was written, the Torah, for instance, we think probably dates back about 3,500 years, but it could be significantly more because we don't know that the earliest copies we have are the earliest copies, and we don't know how long it existed in oral tradition before that. So it could have gone back as far as you can possibly imagine. But assume for a moment that whoever wrote the Torah was somehow experiencing the beginning of the universe, or just the beginning of our world. Imagine going back to when all of those gases were first forming into our sun and then into our planets slowly over millions of years. Imagine seeing that. Imagine that through whatever mystical experience you actually saw that. How would you describe it? How would you describe it to people 4,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, or 6,000 years ago, or however long ago that was experienced? You would probably have to put it in an extremely simplistic language. And there's a lot of very interesting Christian apologists that I've heard who have gone into Genesis and come up with some really interesting correlations between what science says and what the Bible said. And they may be dead on. Personally, as an Omnist, instead of just seeing things as contradictions, I automatically will look at one thing and look at the other thing and think, okay, how did these correlate? How did something that was written 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago, how is it true with what we know today? Not that what we know today is entirely right, but still, how do they correlate? A man named Fritjof Capra wrote this fantastic book back in the 70s called The Tao of Physics. And he was going into Vedic tradition and Buddhist tradition and Taoist tradition and looking at those things and saying, you know, what they were saying about the universe and their mystical writings was really very, very true. You even look at Kabbalic writings and the extremely abstract way that they talk about the creation of the universe, and the way they read Genesis actually could have been read in a very similar way. For instance, almost all mystic traditions say that we're all one. Now, what does that really mean? Well, it means there's no separation between me and you and the universe and all the planets and all the stars. What does that really mean? Well, scientifically, today, we know that at the very least, it means that everything is physically connected. And it is. If you and I are standing in the same room, the only difference between us and the air around us is a variance in density. We are physically connected. The only reason that one person can hear another person is because their vocal cords vibrate the air in such a way that that sound wave travels to another person's ear. We now know that there's no such thing as a void, really. We know that there's something out there between the planets, between the stars, whether it be dark matter, dark energy, these things that we aren't sure what they are yet, but we know that everything is physically connected. And how did these people thousands of years ago know that? Well, I don't know. Was it entirely intuition? Did they somehow reason it? We don't know. But they did say things that are amazingly similar now, if we don't take them too literally, to what scientists are saying. And so, is it entirely infeasible that all of these different religions, having had mystical experiences of how the world began, come up with some very interesting metaphors for things that they couldn't even remotely have explained to people thousands and thousands of years ago? I certainly think it's possible. There are a number of religions that have what you call cosmic egg genesises, where the entire universe came from this egg. And if you look at that type of a creation story, it actually sounds very much like the Big Bang. There's so many different ways we could look at this. But to me, what's really important is, instead of saying, okay, mine is different than yours. My God wore a blue shirt, your God wore a red shirt. Instead of doing that and looking at science and saying, oh, well, you can't be right, because we say it's 6,000 years, you say it's 4 billion years. If we try to find the correlations, if we try to find what's similar, I really think we have a much better chance of getting to the bottom of what's really true than just automatically going for the contradictions. Go into Vedic mythology. They are fascinating. They deal in incredibly large numbers, that they think the universe is billions and billions of years old. It's extremely fascinating how their numbers correlate to what we're finding out might be true today. things that we never would have even thought about, numbers that nobody else was using at the time because they were so incredibly big. So when you look at this kind of thing, just really try to look at it from, I'm not saying a non-literal perspective. I'm not saying that these things aren't literal. I'm not saying that the things in ancient mythology didn't actually happen, but they may not have happened in quite the way that we think they did. So again, that's just my perspective. It's just the way that I look at it. Hopefully that gives you something to think about. I'm the Urban Omnist. I'll see you on the next one. And remember guys, none of this works without you. So subscribe to our channel, like us on Facebook and Twitter, and above all, don't forget to send me those questions.